very much for coming. This is quite possibly the most important subject I've ever picked on to discuss, because it's right here, it's right now. And as you know, if you're familiar with my work, you'll be aware that normally I'm looking at what's coming down the pipe in 5, 10, 20 more years beyond. But here I'm talking about something that is pretty much right on top of us, and that's why I changed my original plan for 2013 and decided that I really had to focus on this particular issue. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a bit the bigger picture for you, because I want you to see why it is that this issue has come about at this particular time and who it is that's driving it. 64% of England sits above shale gas or coal bed methane. Now I'm going to show you a very simplistic graphic which really has very little relationship to what's going to be going on in the UK. But the reason I'm showing it to you is because this is what MPs and MEPs have got on their websites. It's like, let's oversimplify this so that we can delude the public into thinking that it's all safe, it's all simple, and they've got nothing to worry about. So what you see here in this very simplistic graphic is a vertical well. I mean, let me just make the observation, there's no such thing as a vertical well, a truly vertical well, because the motor on the drill bit, as it descends, it drags the drill string in a gentle spiral. That's why the cementing of the casing is so important. What you see down here is the vertical well, and then instead of just being perforated, because when you're going into conventional geology or a conventional reservoir and you're sinking a conventional well, you sink the casing, you secure the casing from the surrounding geology by the cement process, and then you perforate the well. In other words, you blast holes into the casing of the cement, so you create a pathway for the oil or the gas that is contained within that geological strata to come into the well and, of course, migrate to the surface. And it does that because in a natural reservoir, a conventional reservoir, then the oil or the gas is under natural pressure, and once you open the well, it will be forced up the well because that's the path of least resistance. But shale gas and coal bed methane is not found in conventional geology. It's found in what's called tight geology. There's a pretty good description, because what that means is that it's not naturally porous. So if you simply sink a well into tight geology, you perforate the casing, you might get a dribble, if you're lucky, because there's no natural pressure, there's not enough natural pressure to force it to the surface. So what you've got to do is you've got to create artificial porosity by fracturing the geology. And what this overly simplistic graphic is supposed to show is that the geology has been opened up, and as it's opened up, it's kept open with sand that's in the frac fluid, and then once that's opened, then hey presto, the oil or the gas moves to the surface. But like I said, that bears no relationship whatsoever to the reality. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a short animation. Now this is an animation from a Canadian gas company, but it's one of the best that I've seen in terms of explaining the actual process of drilling and then perforating and fracturing a horizontal well for the sole purpose of extracting shale gas from tight geology. And this will enable us to understand the process and for you to start seeing some of the concerns that we have here. And by the way, the video footage I'm going to show you, the politicians and the oil industry denies exists. This is the only way they can deal with it. It's called institutional denial. You just keep denying in the hope that the vast majority of people will believe their denial and won't look for themselves. Now you're going to have to sort of forgive the commentator, because the commentator, of course, is loading the superlatives like how wonderful the process is, how clean the energy, etc., etc. Forget all that. The real significance here is the actual drilling and fracking process.
Natural gas from the Utica Shale is a clean and efficient energy source that is abundant in the St. Lawrence lowlands of Quebec. Let's take a look at the horizontal drilling and stimulation processes that have made shale gas exploration so successful. A drill bit is mounted on the end of the drill pipe. As the bit grinds away, a mixture of water and additives called mud is pumped into the hole to cool the bit and flush the cuttings to the surface. The mud cakes on the walls of the wellbore, keeping it intact and preventing invasion of drilling mud into the surrounding rock formation. The hole is drilled below the deepest freshwater zone or aquifer near the surface. The drill pipe and bit are removed. Surface casing is then inserted into the drilled hole to isolate the freshwater aquifers. Once cemented, it serves as a foundation for the blowout preventer, a safety device that connects the rig to the well bore. Cement is pumped down the casing and out through the opening of the shoe at the bottom of the casing. It is then forced up between the casing and the hole, permanently sealing off the well bore from the fresh water. Once the blowout preventers are installed, the pipe and bit are lowered back down the hole to drill through the plug and cement and continue the vertical section of the well to approximately 300 meters above the planned horizontal leg. This depth is called the kickoff point, where the curve will begin so that the horizontal section can be drilled. Up to this point, the process is the same as drilling a vertical well. Again, the pipe and bit are pulled out of the hole, and a downhole drilling motor with measurement well drilling instruments is lowered back into the hole to begin the angle building process. The distance to make the curve from the kickoff point to where the well bore becomes horizontal is typically just under 300 meters. Once the curve is completed, drilling begins on the well's horizontal section called the lateral. The pipe used to drill the well measures 9 meters in length, and each length weighs approximately 224 kilograms. It takes over 350 pieces of pipe, weighing nearly 79 tons, to drill a 3,200 meter well. At various stages of drilling, the pipe is taken out of the hole for tool and bit changes and put back in. This process is called tripping pipe. When the targeted distance is reached, the drill pipe and bit are removed from the well bore one last time. Production casing is now inserted into the full length of the well bore. Cement is again pumped down the casing and out through the hole in the casing shoe, forcing the cement up between the casing and the wall of the hole, filling the open space known as the annulus. Casing the well is a very important process because it permanently secures the well bore, and it prevents hydrocarbons and other fluids from seeping out into the formation as they are brought to the surface. At this point, the drilling rig is no longer needed. A temporary wellhead is installed, and the location is prepared for the service crew, who will perf, frack, and prepare the well for production. The first of these steps is to perf or perforate the casing. A perforating gun is inserted into the casing to the targeted section of the horizontal leg. An electrical current is sent down the wire line to the perf gun and sets up a charge that shoots small holes through the casing and cement.
Now at this point, this is a conventional well. Okay, if this was in a normal geology, a normal hydrocarbon bearing geology, you drill into the geology and you open the well via the perforation process. A conventional well, and I would have no real problem with that. It's the next stage that is the problem.
And out a short distance into the shale formation. The perf gun is then pulled out of the hole. Next, because shale is tight or compressed, the well will have to be fracked. Known as hydraulic fracturing, this is a process where water, sand, and additives are pumped into the wellbore and down the casing under extremely high pressure. Water and sand make up over 99% of this frac fluid. The remainder consists of compounds commonly found in consumer products. As the mixture is forced out through the perforations and into the surrounding rock, pressure causes the shale to fracture. This creates a pathway connecting the reservoir to the well and allows the gas to flow to the well bore. Next, a temporary plug is used to close off or isolate the perforated and fracked section of the wellbore, so that the next stages of the horizontal leg can be perforated and fracked.
Now, in this wonderful animation, what we've seen here is the perfect frack job. Because what we've seen here is the frack fluid literally fractures just this strata of geology. And the fractures stop very nicely and conveniently just before the edge of this particular geological strata. So in this illustration, if this occurred in reality, it should be reasonable to assume that 100% of what you've pumped down the hole should be recoverable, plus of course the debris from the fractures here. But now let's put a few things in perspective, because in the first instance, no geologist, no petroleum engineer and no chemist can absolutely guarantee how much of the geology is going to actually be fractured. Consequently, it's actually considered to be an outstanding frack job if 50% of what is pumped down the hole is recovered. But let's start putting a few things into perspective here. Anyone got any idea how much water it takes to run a drilling and frack job? Yep, millions. Millions of gallons. In fact, there was a record set in Michigan a few weeks ago where a single well to be drilled and fractured took 21 million gallons of water. They're going to frack another one in a few weeks close by that's going to take 16 million gallons of water. But the average is about 4 million. But let's assume that the wells here are going to be less than demand and consume less than the average. So let's assume that they require 2 million gallons of water. But what you've seen here is a single horizontal section. The reality is that from each vertical section, there will probably be 8 horizontal sections going off of that. So we are looking at potentially 16 million gallons of water being consumed into the well, of which only a half would be recoverable. But once it is converted into a frack fluid, it's no longer water. Although the oil industry loosely calls it water, or water rich is actually the term they use, water rich, but that's like saying rat poison is sugar rich. In the commentary you heard that the frack fluid is 99.5% water and sand. The reality is it's more likely 95% water and sand and 5% additives. And the commentator also said the additives are just normal products found in domestic products. Well, you know, paint thinner is a domestic product. Paint thinners contain xylenes. Xylenes are illegal to be put down the drain. So in other words, if you're using paint thinner in the house, it is illegal to pour the paint thinner down the drain, because the breakdown of xylenes is nigh on impossible. Not, it just takes thousands of years. So it's illegal, yet it's a normal household product. So this is, again, this is how they use the language to obfuscate, to deceive, to keep people thinking that there's nothing to worry about. Now let's, again, put it in perspective. It's 5%. 5% of 2 million gallons. 5% of 2 million gallons? I think it's about 100,000. 100,000 gallons of additive. So we're not talking a beaker full, we're talking a significant chunk. Now, in the US, they are draining the Great Lakes. They are using the water out of the Great Lakes, because to frack, you must use fresh water. You cannot use salt water, because the salt is abrasive and it creates friction. And obviously, one of the nicknames for a frack fluid is slick water, because you want to be able to pump it downhole without any loss of pressure. You want as much pressure at the bottom as you're pumping at the top. So it has to be fresh water. In Australia, they are sucking the Great Artesian Basin dry. The Great Artesian Basin is estimated to need 85 billion gallons of water a year just to naturally replenish. But the Australian government has authorised the extraction companies, the gas companies and the mining companies, to remove 500 billion gallons of water a year from the Great Artesian Basin. That is 6 times the amount that it needs to naturally replenish. So in the US they have the Great Lakes and they have the Great Rivers. And of course they have a very thinly, densely populated country compared to the UK. The same with Australia. They have the Great Artesian Basin, but it's also a very thinly populated country, apart from obviously the city areas. This country is not thinly populated. To put it in perspective, Colorado, which is right at the forefront of the shale gas industry in the US, Colorado is just a little bit more than twice the size of England. Yet it has a population of 1/10 that of England. So England is 20 times more densely populated than Colorado. And we're going to look at some of the effects of the fracking industry on that thinly populated population in Colorado and also in northern New Mexico. The other critical issue here, and I'm going to share with you one of the outrageous pieces of obfuscation that was presented at a public meeting in Bath by the Chief Executive Officer of one of the pioneer companies, UK Methane, which has as one of its owners Coastal Oil and Gas, whose chairman is Lord John Brown. The chairman of UK Methane, which is a Bridgend-based company in South Wales, is a Welshman by the name of Gerwyn Llewellyn-Williams. And in the public meeting in Bath, he made this observation. He said, yeah, you know, I hear all the concerns about the water consumption in the fracking process, but for each frack job, we're not using any more water than it takes to water a golf course for a month. But he's missing a key element here. You know, I lived in Dubai when they were building the amazing Emirates golf course, literally out of the desert. And these guys obviously were oil rich, and they called in the best drainage engineers they could get to design the drainage system for the Emirates golf course. And they pride themselves that 80% of the water that they pump onto the golf course is actually recycled through their drainage system.
Las Vegas is the same.
It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense, especially in a desert area. The issue with the frac fluid is that once you've mixed those chemicals with it, it's lost to the system. It's gone. So, you know, when we think about how we normally use water, you know, even when we're drinking it, it's never lost to the system, one way or another. Even with their industrial processes, every effort is made to purify the water and return it to the system. With the frac fluids, much more difficult. You know, in the US, they've used a horrendous system called evaporation pits, which is literally lifting the produced water, it's called, another misnomer, the produced water, the used frac fluid, and pumping it into a plastic-lined pit right next door to the well. And then what they do is they put a pump motor in the middle of the pit to create like a spray. You think, oh, that's nice, a fountain. But the purpose of the spray is to accelerate the evaporation process. And when you look at the health impacts of the people that live downwind of those evap pits, it ain't a pretty sight. Now, in Europe, if they actually start fracking, they're not going to use evap pits. So when I met with the Quadrilla management team on the 1st of February of this year, and I asked the Chief Executive Officer what the plan was for the produced water, he basically said, we're still working on it. The short-term plan is to put the produced water into double-skinned tanks whilst they think about it. Well, the company that actually purified the produced water from the first 2 frac jobs has actually declined to tender for any future business. Now that speaks volumes. Now what happened to the produced water from the first 2 frack jobs? Well, there's a Manchester-based company who did the purification, and then it was pumped into the Manchester Ship Canal, and as far as I understand, without any third-party oversight. So we are totally reliant on the integrity of the company in Manchester when they declare that, yeah, it was purified before we pumped it into the Manchester Ship Canal. Now, when I was with the Quadrilla management team, I was particularly interested in one of the individuals, a guy called Mark Miller, because he actually used to work for my former company, Schlumberger. Now, I didn't know him when he worked there, because he left the company in 1986. He worked in the US with Schlumberger, with Dow Schlumberger. I didn't go to the US until 1994. But you know, I knew that we would know some of the same people, because you know, in the US organisation, a lot of the people in Schlumberger had been there for, you know, basically since they left college. And this guy was standing talking to a group of local residents, and in response to one of the residents' questions, who asked him, he said, you know, what happens when frac fluid contaminates the water supply? And this guy turned round and said, there has never been a proven case. You've got to love the terminology. There has never been a proven case of frac fluids contaminating groundwater. And I have to tell you, at this point, I did actually sort of lose it a bit. Because it's just an outright lie. And I knew it was a lie. And I think I just said something like, you what? And I said, look, you know, why did you make that statement? Because I said this gentleman can actually go home and sit at his computer, and within about 3.5 nanoseconds, he can come up with evidence that frac fluids have contaminated water. And what he said was really incredible. He said, listen very carefully. He said, what I said is, there's never been a proven case. And, well, what he's really hanging his hat on, I think, is a piece of legislation that was introduced in 2005 by somebody who you might recognise, Uncle Dick Cheney, former Chief Executive Officer of Haliburton, between 1995 and 2000, when he was, of course, sworn in on the White House lawn as Vice President. By the way, he was actually still on the Haliburton payroll for the duration of his Vice Presidency. But he wasn't allowed to take the salary, it was put into trust for him. But ostensibly, he's still on the payroll. And in 2005, this guy introduced what is known as the Haliburton loophole. All you've got to Google is Haliburton loophole, and you'll find a whole bunch of articles written on this. But this is when Congress passed the Energy Policy Act, the controversial clause that excluded nearly everything used in fracking from being regulated by the US Environmental Protection Agency. Well, in addition, Cheney ensured that the oil and gas industry was exempted from the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So when you're exempt from everything, yeah, how's anybody ever going to prove that, you know, because all the various agencies effectively close ranks. And forgive me, you know, when Mark Miller says, oh, but you know, you don't worry, because this is Europe, this is England. Yeah, the regulatory bodies in England are much more stringent than in the US. Well, first of all, we don't really have any regulatory bodies yet. They're being set up because we now have the Department of Energy, Climate Change, and Unconventional Gas and Oil. So the Department of, or the Office of Unconventional Gas and Oil is really just sort of starting to find its feet. But can anybody remember the last time that the water supply in this country was accidentally polluted? Yes, it was, absolutely. Do you remember when it was?
1980-something.
Very good, it's 1988. 1988, and what happened at Camelford in Cornwall was that a tanker driver was delivering a tanker load of concentrated aluminium sulfate, which I think is used to deal with algae in the water supply. Anyway, it's used in the water supply in absolutely microscopic quantities. I mean, 20,000 gallons would last you for years. Anyway, this guy was delivering this tanker load. When he turned up at the pumping station in Camelford, it was unmanned. So he phoned the local office of South West Water, or whatever it was they were called at the time, and they told him where to find the key, which was under a rock by the gate. The only problem was that this key fitted every damn tank in the pumping station, and this guy inadvertently pumped concentrated aluminium sulfate directly into the local water supply. Now, funnily enough, the local residents noticed it immediately because it stank to high heaven, and it tasted like... So they were calling the office to ask for advice, what was going on here. And do you know what the response was? Mix it with orange juice and hold your nose. And you'll be fine. Well, anybody got any idea when it was that the British government finally admitted that there had indeed been a serious accidental contamination of the Camelford water supply? It was 2010. And credit where credit's due, it was actually due to a 3-year campaign by the Daily Mail. I mean, not running articles every day, but just digging up more and more evidence to show that not only had there been a contamination, but there'd been a cover-up. So for 23 years, the contamination was covered up by institutional denial. But provided nobody ever breaks ranks and actually admits that there was a problem, then you can just keep denying that there was a problem. Well, eventually, the Daily Mail had presented enough evidence so that there had to be an admission, and I guess they decided after 23 years, well, okay, so what? I mean, it's estimated that some 20,000 people suffered in some way, shape or form. It's not known if anybody actually died because of it, because no one was looking for it. Because officially, there was no contamination. So, forgive me if I don't exactly have a lot of confidence in British regulatory authorities who will close ranks, especially when a guy like Lord John Brown is at the heart of government. They'll close ranks and just deny that there's any problem. We're going to show you some actual footage from Australia. Now, none of the footage I'm going to show you from Australia is older than November 25th last year. And the reason that Australia is important is because the area that's been fracked in Australia, which is really northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, has only been fracked for the last 2.5, 3 years. So this is what happens in a relatively short space of time. When we start to look at the US, it's been going on for closer to 2 decades. But the reason Australia is so significant is because this has happened so quickly. Now, the guy that you're going to see in the video is a guy called Brian Monk. Now, 3 years ago, this guy, by his own admission, was your archetypal average Aussie. He was just interested in a chilled life. Crack a tube of Foster's, throw a shrimp on the barbie, and he bought 5,000 acres in southern Queensland with a view that he and his son were going to start farming it, and then basically his son was going to manage it, and he was going to just live a life of relaxed luxury. Then the gas industry moved in. Now, Brian has 5,000 acres. There is no gas infrastructure on his property at all. Okay, so there's no rigs, no pads, nothing on his property, but they're all around him. And his property is part of what has been licensed. And in fact, the property is divided between 2 of the gas companies. Now, they don't have to tell him that they're drilling under his property. Because in Australia, in the UK, and in much of the US, the law is based on split estate. This is the legal term, split estate. It's also the name of an excellent documentary. Split estate refers to the fact that the owner of the land owns the surface and just about enough to maybe grow a carrot and a potato. But woe betide you if you find any gold or silver in that top layer, because that's owned by the Crown, and hydrocarbons are owned by the state. So split estate, where you have split estate, the owner, in theory, still controls right of access to the land. But the British government's actually thought about that already, and in the US they thought about that too. But in Australia at the moment, there is still the power to control right of access. But because of the capacity for horizontal drilling, it doesn't mean to say they ain't going to be drilling under your property. So we don't know for sure that the gas companies have drilled under Brian's property. I mean, we can assume they have, but we don't know for sure. But what you're going to see is evidence or the impact of drilling within the vicinity. Now, in the first clip here, Brian and his son, Barry, and his wife are sitting on the veranda around the table. It's a nice day, it's the end of November, it's the end of the dry season, there's a gentle breeze, and there's a gas detector on the middle of the table. The gas detector detects 10 non-indigenous gases. So in a normal environment, the gas detector would be silent. It's picking up 10 non-indigenous gases. Now we can't tell from this particular gas detector what those gases are, but most likely we're talking methane, because that's what's being mined, coal bed methane from the area.
No comment.
10 gases.
That's unbelievable. That is actually scary. That's... Well, that didn't help, Kathy. You stopped it from clicking.
Well, that's just to say that
We're safe here now, is it?
I've pushed it your way more. There we go, it's come back, it's still in the air. I'm just sort of trying to press fresh air through it.
Well, not from cow farts.
Koala farts.
Not
So
koala
is
farts.
this methane
cow breaths.
only?
No.
Oh,
10
oh.
gases. No comment.
Is there a list
no
of
comment.
10 gases?
That's unbelievable.
In the next clip, Brian and his son have moved about 100 yards away from the house. Like I said, it's the end of the dry season, so the ground is really hard baked. Okay, so just take a look at what happens when they break the surface.
Instant, no reading. We've got a bit of a breeze blowing today. Okay, bring in the workforce. And we've got quite a deflection. I don't know whether the camera can pick that up.
So we can.
So what's happened is that the fracking process has opened up the tight geology, and because the frac fluid is aggressive, that 50% of the frac fluid that's lost down the hole just keeps on going. It just keeps looking for the path of least resistance. And of course it's aggressive, it's got acids in it, it's deliberately designed to eat away at the rock. So it will just keep on going until it finds, well, the path of least resistance. And eventually either ends up in the water table, or it just sort of percolates through into geology that has a natural porosity, and then the gas will start to migrate to the surface. And of course we're talking an odourless gas. That's why the miners used to take canaries down the pits before the daily safety lamp was invented. When the canary started to get agitated, that was the time to turn and go in the other direction. And if the canary did an impersonation of a Norwegian blue, it's time to hightail it out of there. The next clip is Brian and his son driving down to a well located just outside a community called Tara. They've got the AC, the air conditioning off in the car, so they've just got the vents open and it's just the natural air, the outside air, coming into the vehicle as they drive down. And the gas detector is sitting on the dashboard. picture. So basically they are driving through a contaminated environment. Now, you can't smell it. The other thing is that the gas industry, the shale gas industry says, no, we don't contaminate water. There's no evidence. There's absolutely no evidence of methane migrating into water supplies. And methane's always been in water, which is actually true. It's always been in water, not all water, but some water. It's always been there, in microscopic quantities. And this is why, really, what we need now is we need surveys on water quality and soil quality and air quality, so that we have a baseline, so that if they do start this, and I hope to God they don't, but if they do start this, we've got a baseline. Because otherwise they are simply going to claim that that was there anyway. Well, there's two types of methane anyways. There's the biomethane, which is the stuff that is naturally in the water in relatively microscopic quantities. And then there's the thermomethane, which is basically that which migrates from the gas fields that are fracked, and that's what migrates up through the geology into the water supply. This is from the end of last year, and this is Brian, the same guy we just seen, Brian Monk. This is him running water from his water bore into a vessel, and then he has literally rigged up a device to establish whether or not there is methane content in that water.
Okay, this is our rig up to prove that the government's been lying to us about there being no gas in this water bore. This water bore has now been running for a few minutes, and as you can see, it's burning gas. This would be the gas that the government maintains isn't present, that the Queensland scientists at a couple of laboratories have said there's no gas in this water bore. So every Queenslander can feel quite confident in the fact that the government's tested these gas bores and said that there's no leakage. They can be so confident that they're probably corrupt or lying. Corrupt, lying and incompetent. One or the, it's got to be something. Yep.
We've got BG Group, QGC, on one side of our property and Origin Energy on the other side. Their coal seam gas tenements divide our property in two. We do not have any coal seam gas infrastructure on our property, or so we thought, but this flame is coming from the water from our registered stock and domestic water bore.
I think that is the most damning. It's not a huge amount of gas, but it is so damning because it's there all the time.
Both coal seam gas companies have been heavily extracting water from the aquifers under us, leaving us with very little water and more gas.
That was funny.
It's a good job Brian has a sense of humour, I tell you. Well, after they had been down to the rig at Tara, where they were driving when the gas detector was on the dashboard. When they got home that night, Brian's son, Barry, started to feel very unwell. In fact, he started to slur his words, hadn't been drinking, started to slur his words, and then he basically lost all coherence. Anyway, then he managed to sort of say he was going to go to bed, and as he got up, his leg buckled from under him. So they called an ambulance, and he was taken to hospital, and he was kept in hospital, under observation for a few days. And then they dismissed him from hospital, they released him from hospital, claiming it was calcium deficiency. Calcium deficiency. Methane is a neuroinhibitor. So one of the symptoms of getting methane into the body, I mean obviously if you get it in excessive quantities you're going to be asphyxiated because it's going to force the oxygen out, but if you're taking it in relatively small quantities on a consistent basis, then like all things not everyone is susceptible in the same way. But there's little doubt that Barry's symptoms were related to an overdose effectively of methane. Methane has the neuroinhibitors, it also contains DNA disruptors and endocrine disruptors. In this country, we're talking about the companies that want to start this fracking process being responsible. Forgive me if I have zero confidence in that, especially with Lord John Brown at the helm. Profit before all else. What's happening here is we're looking at a potential situation where large tranches of the population are not going to get any choice in it. Because we're entering into an era, shale gas extraction, which is pure Russian roulette. Because the geologists, the petroleum engineers and the chemists have no clue. They will claim they do, of course, but it's no more than an educated guess based on past experience. But that's all it is. It's an educated guess as to how much geology is actually going to be fractured. And where that fluid is going to migrate to. And then where the methane gas that they're trying to mine is also going to migrate to. And the first time you notice it is probably when you go down to a river or a stream, because you see the bubbling. In Brian's ranch in Queensland, in southern Queensland right now, it's the rainy season, it's the end of the wet season now. But when I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, he said, Ian, he said, it's unbelievable. He said, of course my ground's waterlogged, but it's just a sea of bubbles. You can't, obviously when the ground was hard baked, at least that was some protection against the gas migrating out of the soil. But now that obviously the ground is a sea of mud and it's covered in water, you just see the bubbles coming through. And of course you heard him say in the film that the environmental agencies and the water authorities say you haven't got a problem. Total denial. Now, the opposition. The industry knows that it's going to meet with opposition, whether it's the traditional opposition groups, the environmentalists, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, or independents. They're trying to dismiss anybody who dares to challenge the dash for gas as an eco-mentalist or as a communist or a socialist. Any term they can come up with that will marginalise them. But you know that they know they're in for a run when Quadrilla have just brought in a guy from Betfair who used to work with Microsoft to focus on PR. The guy knows nothing at all about the oil and gas industry. His background is Microsoft and Betfair. I mean, his forte is obviously lobbying at government level. But the fact that they're paying this guy, I mean, I can guarantee you this guy is probably on at least £250,000. So you know that they know they're in for a run here. But if I haven't got your attention, with the prospect of water contamination, soil contamination, and air contamination, this might get your attention, has in some areas. This was an article that appeared in The Observer last June, worry for homeowners who face the threat of fracking. It says property prices in some areas are being threatened by fracking. Well, that was actually based on an article that had been, or a report that had been commissioned by the financial website, This Is Money. And in that report it said shale gas could redraw the economic map of Britain, but prices of houses near wells could fall by 24%. Well, let me tell you the reality. When the gas industry moves in, property prices crash. I mean, this is the case in Blackpool right now. Since the second earthquake, the property market in Blackpool has totally tanked. Now, I have first-hand experience of this because some very good friends of mine who I've spoken in Blackpool probably twice a year for the last 8 years, and every time I speak in Blackpool I always stayed with them. But after the second earthquake in May of 2011, they decided it was time to accelerate their retirement plan, which basically was to leave the area and to move to Spain. So they found an apartment in Spain, moved to Spain, but they obviously still needed to sell their house in the UK. So they contacted estate agents. 3 estate agents came around and looked at the property, this beautiful 5-bedroom house in Porton-le-Fylde, which once upon a time was a very desirable suburb of Blackpool. The estate agents all valued the property at £325,000. But my friend said, you know what, we'd really like to sell it very quickly, so we're going to put it on the market at £250,000. And the estate agents said, but you'll upset the market. And they said, well, not for long, because hopefully someone's going to realise that it's a real bargain and snap it up. Well, so the property's been on the market for almost 2 years. Do you know how many offers they've had on that property? A big fat 0. Well, we were actually talking about the problem of the housing market in Blackpool when I was visiting with them in Spain in the middle of March. And while I was there, they got a phone call from the agent, and they were really excited because they thought, oh, maybe we've got an offer. Well, they didn't have an offer. They had somebody who was interested in the house, and they would have bought it, but it's a couple who are both single parents. They both got 2 kids, and they both have 3-bedroom houses, and they want to move in together. But they can't, because they can't move 4 kids into a 3-bedroom house. So they were interested in my friend's house, but they can't buy it because they can't sell their houses. Anyway, they had managed to rent one of their properties, and so they asked the agent if my friend might be prepared to consider renting the 5-bedroom property on the basis that when they sell at least one of their houses, they could then maybe be in a position to buy it. Well, let me tell you, if they sell one of their houses and they come up with an offer, even probably close to 200,000, my friend will probably bite their arm off. Because, it's a liability. It's not an asset right now, it's a liability. Okay, at least they've got somebody living in it, which is, at least keeping it in reasonable shape. But I came back from that trip to Spain and I thought, well, I'm going to do a little bit of research myself. So I called around some of the Blackpool estate agents, and well, you got to remember they're estate agents. So of course they told me it was a buyer's market, and that right now I could have the pick and choose of almost any property I wanted in Blackpool, especially if I was a cash buyer. Anyway, there was one estate agent in particular who I spoke to who was actually familiar with my work, and he said, Ian, he said, absolutely right. He said, it is a big issue, it's a very concerning issue. And he said, and actually, since the moratorium has been lifted, a lot of property has come onto the market. But most of it will probably never sell, unless a ban is introduced. And he said, even then, I think people are nervous that it might be lifted, and so in all probability, the Blackpool area housing market is not going to be in good shape for at least a decade. Well, it's exactly the same elsewhere. This is North Texas. This is a family called the Ruggerios. This is in the gas field just to the northwest of Dallas. Beautiful part of the States, the hill country there. And here it is. This is from the article. The Ruggerios purchased their home in 2004 and watched a gas and oil company set up wells 300 feet from their back door in September 2009. So 1 year later, the $250,000 property that they put $50,000 worth of work into had been valued at $75,000. The reality is that the only people who would probably offer them $75,000 is a gas company for open access onto their land. This is what they have to deal with. This is the Ruggerios. This is the view from their kitchen window. This is the view from their back garden. Here's the house, here's the well. In Colorado, they are now placing wells directly alongside schools. They are coming, I mean, in Split Estate, you will see that they're actually starting to move into communities. And I published an article in my newsletter a few weeks ago showing how the gas companies are now just not giving a damn, and they're coming right into the heart of communities to access the shale. Remember, the horizontal drilling, because it's tight geology, you can only horizontally drill for a few hundred yards. You can't drill for miles. I mean, in the south of England, we have a rig in the New Forest. It's been there for 23 years. And that drilled 8 miles out into the offshore field because the local authorities of Bournemouth and Poole didn't want a rig on the horizon. So they agreed with the oil company to put the rig inside the New Forest and then drill out under the sea. But that's drilling through porous geology. And this stuff you can only drill a few hundred yards. That's why they're coming right into the towns. To show you what it looks like, because they need 6 to 8 vertical wells per square mile to maximise the shale. This is what it looks like in southern Queensland. This is about a square kilometre. Now here they've got no real issue because they've got relatively open access. Each well requires about 400 truck journeys. Tankers, plus the rig, plus pumps. When you run the frack, you're going to have anything from a dozen to 2 dozen frack pumps. And by the way, when they fire up, and you'll know, especially if you're downwind. So we don't have the infrastructure in this country to deal with this. All the motorways are going to end up looking like the A14, the road from Felixstowe, which is one lane, it's a convoy of containers. We just don't have the infrastructure for this. And the other issue that isn't being discussed yet is the health impact. I mean, we've got a National Health Service that's dying on its feet, and yet this is undoubtedly going to put a burden on the health service. Even though, of course, the oil industry and the government are going to deny that the increase in negative health has anything at all to do with their activities. But the problem is that the government, the British government in particular, already realises that they're going to be up against some opposition. So at the back end of last year, they initiated a bill called the Growth and Infrastructure Bill. This bill went through Parliament in record time, 55 days. The reason it went through in record time was because MPs had been told that this was the bill that was going to remove the bureaucracy and red tape from small businesses. In this current economic climate, we need people to develop entrepreneurial skills. And this is going to take away all the obstacles that are in place. And of course the MPs went, yeah, okay, I'll vote for that. It rushes through Parliament. It goes to the House of Lords. And when it's being debated in the Lords, there is some realisation that this is actually a little bit more than just a bill that removes red tape from entrepreneurs and small businesses. And the Telegraph, to their credit, actually published this article in February, fears that fracking could be fast-tracked. The Growth and Infrastructure Bill actually creates an opportunity for the British government to decree that something is so significant for the well-being of the UK economy or for our national energy security, even though we can't claim sovereignty of it because it's controlled by the EU, they can simply overrule any local opposition. So, one of the things here is in trying to flag up to local councillors that they've been taken out of the equation. Earlier this year, Quadrilla in the Fylde Peninsula announced that they wouldn't be doing any drilling or fracking in 2013. And some local activists went, yeah, we've got them on the run. And in South Wales and in the Mendip in Somerset, UK Methane announced that they were withdrawing all of the planning applications that they had submitted to the local authorities to place their pads. That's what you saw on that picture from South Queensland. And the activists in Somerset went, yeah, we've got them on the run. Sorry, ain't that simple. The reason that Quadrilla have announced that they're not going to drill this year, the reason that UK Methane have announced that they're pulling their planning applications, is because they are waiting for the Growth and Infrastructure Bill to be put on the statute books. It's now got royal assent, by the way, but to be placed on the statute books so that Osborne and Cameron can effectively give these guys the green light. And no amount of local opposition will be taken into account. And at that point, what are you left with? Well, you're left with the situation that they have in Australia, which is basically direct action. Trying to blockade the infrastructure from coming onto the pad. Well, let me show you what happened in Australia, because in Ireland, Shell have been called out, paying the Irish Gardaí, the police, directly to protect the Shell infrastructure in North West Ireland, in the Rossport facility, against the local community. In Australia, basically they're doing the same. I mean, just like the miners' strike, you know, where it was the Metropolitan Police that were put into Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, so that you never had police from the local community, you never had anybody in the local community who might have empathy with the strikers. Well, they're doing the same in Australia. They bring in the police from the cities, who have no empathy with the people who live in the country. So let me show you what happened here. This was an attempt at a blockade. In the immediate period prior to this shot being taken, a woman had been seriously injured. She'd been knocked over by one of the trucks going onto the pad. An ambulance has been called.
He's a photographer.
I want to close the door.
Good. Place got permission, yeah? Yeah. Photographer.
You get the picture. I mean, this is the way the corporatocracy works. It is the priority to get the corporations wherever it is that they feel they need to be. The reality is that we don't even need the hydrocarbons in this quantity. In fact, we've never needed the hydrocarbons in this quantity. Has anyone got any idea when it was that Henry Ford was instructed to stop building the electric car? It was 1896. 1896. He was instructed to stop building the electric cars by a guy called John D. Rockefeller, owner of Standard Oil. Had to?
They built one that was 1.0.
Oh, that was 1946. And he was told to shut that down too. The reason that the electric cars were popular amongst the wealthy in the late 19th century was because they were clean, they were quiet, and they required very little maintenance. You plugged them in at night, there was an infrastructure in the city of New York and other cities where you could drive them in from the short commute. I mean, they weren't the cities that we know today. Plug them in the streets and then drive home. Well, once John D. Rockefeller had got the electric car production line shut down, and by the way, 2/3 of Ford's production in the late 1890s was electric vehicles. In fact, that was pretty much mirrored in New York. There were 2,500 vehicles registered, 1,800 of them were electric. Once John D. Rockefeller got the electric production line shut down, he was also he was buying up and shutting down the electric tramways that had been built in many of the cities around the US, and then replacing them with buses. The argument being the buses were more flexible with regard to the changing demographics. But then as the personal vehicle became more affordable, the buses were wound down so that people had the incentive to have their own personal vehicle. Which of course meant that because it was the internal combustion engine, that John D. Rockefeller had created his unending revenue stream. And then with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 in the US, then that was the first time, by the way, income tax was introduced in the US. But of course, as the government started to finance their projects through borrowing from private bankers, they had to repay the loan and the interest on those loans, so they needed taxation revenues. And even today, the most effective way of fleecing people of their disposable income after income tax is through taxes on hydrocarbons. Yeah, that's why when we fill up at the pump, we're paying, what, 133, give or take, about 133 for a litre of fuel, yet over 80 pence worth of that is tax. And of course we have a mobility tax. I mean, if you want to get around, you need fuel, and therefore you're paying a tax. The other part of the cabal that controls this is the engine efficiency. So doesn't it strike anybody sort of really quite strange that the average engine efficiency is exactly the same today as it was 70 odd years ago? The average vehicle returns 35 miles a gallon. Obviously some do more, some do less. The average is 35 miles a gallon. It's very carefully calculated, because they've calculated how much fuel they want to sell and how much taxation revenue they want to get. If you start to mess with your engine, you can be charged with tax evasion. It's like if a farmer uses red diesel, i.e. agricultural diesel, on a vehicle he drives on the road, it's tax evasion. Every vehicle is a revenue collection device. And that's why any alternatives are suppressed. It's a myth that there is any real interest by the hydrocarbon companies or the governments to find viable alternatives. The only way in which they will permit a viable alternative to effectively come into the mainstream is provided there is a way to tax it as efficiently as hydrocarbons. So what they do is they allow 8% of the total market over to alternatives, because one of the reasons that the hydrocarbon industry wants to know about alternatives is so they can shut them down, normally through buying up the patents. And if the person won't sell the patent, then they deal with them in another way. This from the 1990s.
Okay, it never wears out because there's no moving parts.
In the top our news here at 6 o'clock, an age-old dream becoming a reality. A local inventor has discovered a way, hear this, to use water to run your car.
It's a major breakthrough that will no doubt make motorists happy. And as Ralph Robinson explains, the Pentagon is also showing lots of interest in this project.
Water has always been considered a precious commodity, but Stan Meyer's invention may make it even more valuable. He has developed what's called a water fuel cell. It has taken the place of his old gas tank. The water fuel cell breaks down water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen is used to run his dune buggy.
I don't care if you use rainwater, well water, city water, ocean water. If you don't have any fresh water, go ahead and use snow. If you don't have any snow available to you, they use salt water because there's no adverse effect to the fuel cell.
Myers started working on this project 4 years ago. He's not a scientist. He isn't even a chemist. In fact, he never graduated from college. Myers was determined, he says, to design something to protect this country from oil embargoes.
And we have calculated that if we take the dune buggy from Los Angeles to New York, we would roughly use 22 gallons of water.
The Pentagon flew a lieutenant colonel in last week to look at Myers' invention. There's talk of possibly using it in the Star Wars defense program and to run army tanks. Myers is currently perfecting a water fuel cell for cars. It will cost about $1,500. He says it won't need any maintenance and you won't have to replace it. It'll be at least 2 years before the fuel system goes into mass production. The day it happens will be one the fuel industry hates, but it'll put a smile on the face of those who've had to say at one time or another, fill her up.
You heard what the commentator said. It'll be at least 2 years before the water cell goes into production, and that'll be a day the oil industry hates. Well, that'll be a day the oil industry makes sure doesn't happen. In fact, Stan Myers, he turned down a multi-billion-dollar offer because he wasn't interested. I mean, he was wealthy, he was an inventor, and he wasn't interested in signing the invention over to the corporatocracy. He wanted to develop it himself. They made sure that it wasn't going anywhere. So, when you're talking about the issue of fracking, with whoever it is you can address it with, I mean, some people are talking to their MPs, some people are talking to their local councillors, their district councillors, or even just share it around, because we've got to get this like poll tax. It's got to get into the mass consciousness. There's not a lot of point in telling them that, you know, we don't need oil, because they're just going to dismiss you as a rampant conspiracy theorist. So we've got to give a viable alternative. So, you know, we are unfortunately and tragically locked into a hydrocarbon economy. Whatever anybody else says with alternatives like wind power and sea power, yeah, they're all viable potentially, but the reality is that the hydrocarbon industry dominates the corporatocracy. And governments are quite happy to maintain that domination because of the tax revenues they get from it. So we've got to offer viable alternatives. You know, some of the activists are basically, I mean, they call themselves extreme energy activists. And there's no question. I mean, they don't, I think, really help themselves by basically saying we want to shut this down, shut that down, we don't want to do any drilling. Yeah, I mean, that would be the ideal world. We don't need to, period. But, you know, it's baby steps. In the first instance, the critical issue is shutting down the drilling and fracking process on land in this country. If we don't do this, in 10, 15, 20 years, we're not going to recognise this country. You know, the soil is going to be poisoned, we're not going to be able to grow crops, we're not going to be able to raise livestock, you know, we're going to be dependent on the corporations for our drinking water. So imagine a situation where, you know, in a few years' time, we are totally reliant on the corporations for the water. And we should take that seriously, because last year, the chief executive officer of Nestle, a guy called Peter Brabeck, recorded an interview where he stated that water should not be considered a human right. That access to water should be controlled by the corporations. In other words, unless you're a willing corporate slave, then you deny yourself the right to access water. These socio-psychopathic global corporatists have a game plan. It's called Agenda 21. It's been their policy and philosophy since the Earth Conference in Rio in 1992. It was adopted by the UN almost immediately afterwards. And in Agenda 21, it specifically calls for the move towards moving people away from the land into controlled environments, i.e. the cities. And if you see the map of the western states of the US and how much land in the western states the federal government has purchased, primarily so that they can use it obviously for the gas drilling, and they don't have to worry about owners not letting them on the land because they own the land. And what they're going to be left with is, you know, wasteland and cities, the controlled environments. So, you know, we've got to wake up to a reality, which is that within a generation, 2 at the outside, if we allow this to kick off, you know, we really are contributing to creating a future for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations that actually doesn't even bear thinking about. And I believe these guys know it. They know exactly what they're doing. That's why they obfuscate, that's why they lie, that's why they deceive, that's why they refuse to be transparent in any way, shape or form. You know, we're sold the meagre benefits. This is what we're told are the benefits. Cheap gas. Well, that one got blown out of the water a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, when the cross-party group that were commissioned to look at the potential for cheap gas from drilling for shale gas and coal bed methane in this country, and they basically said it's not likely to happen. Well, of course it's not likely to happen. When did you ever know prices go down? You know, they're just going to reap the corporate benefits. The balance of trade. I don't think so. You know, our borrowing is increasing. When the current pair of clowns took office, our borrowing was 82% of GDP. Now it's at 86% of GDP, and it's forecast to be at 100% of GDP by 2018. Once the borrowing reaches 100% of GDP, you're owned by the banks. Like Ireland, like Greece, like Spain, like Portugal, Italy, soon France, and the UK. So we may be slowing it down a little bit, but it ain't going away. So that's not going to happen. The energy security, well, we already explained, we don't have any energy security. That's all taken care of by the Treaty of Lisbon. And here's the UK government's version of behavioural adjustment payments. This is from the Daily Telegraph just last week. The government to offer cheaper energy bills to communities that don't oppose fracking. Yeah, and community briberies. I mean, like, you know, you need a new play park, you need a new community centre. Yeah, they'll throw money at these communities because they know that this is the only way in which they can get them to ignore the risks and the perils associated with the industry being in their backyard. You know, 2 weekends ago, I visited with a guy in Blackpool who is absolutely of the opinion that the damage to his house was caused by the second earthquake. And he showed me all the cracks in the house, around the door frames. He said these weren't there before May 2011. So not only has his house got no value, the insurance company won't touch it because it was an earthquake, act of God. Despite the fact that Quadrilla have actually acknowledged that the seismic events were most probably related to their fracking. But he can't get the repairs done on the house because the insurance companies say it was an act of God. Anyway, then he gets a letter through the post saying, well, we're not insuring your house anyway anymore. So this is the other problem. No one can insure their property. So this is the downside. The water contamination, the soil contamination, the air contamination, the water shortages. You know, this is a country that goes from feast to famine in water in a heartbeat. You know, and where are we going to get these millions of gallons of water that are needed for 800 wells that David Cameron's talking about? Seismic events. The property prices crash wherever you look around the world. Same in US, Canada, Australia, Blackpool. It's not going to be any different anywhere else. No buildings insurance and large areas of the UK potentially uninhabitable. You know, I'm not interested really in trying to get this into the mainstream media. In fact, every time I have been invited to participate in anything by the BBC or the other mainstream channels, I've always said thanks but no thanks, because anything that's recorded, not a chance. Not a chance. I will only do live stuff. So the mainstream media are not the route. So the method that I'm trying to, if you like, undermine their dash for gas is by holding these events, regardless of how many people, holding these events all around the country. I'm trying to sow the seeds. You know, hopefully you guys will go away and take a look at this stuff for yourself. If you do nothing else, you know, look at Split Estate, this documentary that I've mentioned. Look at Gasland. Look at the documentary put out by the pro-frackers, which is called Frack Nation, which is produced by an Irishman called Phelim McAleer. But you know, look at both sides of the coin. Like, decide for yourself. You know, I've shown you the footage from Brian Monk in Australia, because for me that is the most damning footage that you can see from an area. I haven't picked and choose from around the world. That's one guy's farm. And I've showed you prima facie evidence of the contamination of the soil, the contamination of the air, and the contamination of the water. So what makes the UK so special that it ain't going to happen here? Nothing. I do believe that we can bring about the change. It starts with everyone obviously trying to educate themselves and then sharing this information and trying to educate others. But you know, there's always something that comes out of left field. And back in 2009, I recorded a presentation called The Green Agenda and Population Reduction. And in that presentation, I made the observation, I said, we are literally a few weeks away from seeing the first stages of global governance being foisted upon us. Because I'd read the scripts for the forthcoming Copenhagen meeting in December 2009. I knew exactly what the game plan was. The game plan was to initiate a global carbon trading process, all based on the global or climate change agenda. And in that presentation I said, you know, barring something coming completely out of the blue, completely out of left field, then by January we are going to have the first stages of global governance in place. Literally a week after I recorded that presentation, the ClimateGate emails released. Now a few people have read them, but you know, there is a wonderful document on the web. It's written by a guy called Dr. John P. Costello. It's a document that he first published in January 2010. It's called the ClimateGate emails. And you don't even need to get beyond the first 20 pages to appreciate the magnitude of the lies and the deception perpetrated by the climate scientists, all in the interest of maintaining their grants. You know, how they were literally manipulating data, how they were manipulating who was or wasn't involved in the peer review process, and so on and so forth. So consequently, you know, those people who did make a little bit of effort to look at the ClimateGate emails knew that all of the climate change agenda had been effectively called into question. Now these guys don't give up because they've been on this quest for 60 years, so they backed off a bit. Now they've had 2 more conferences since Copenhagen, one in Cancun and one in Qatar, and they're still not back to where they thought they were in November 2009. But they're still pushing forward because as of April the 1st this year, for the first time, we have carbon taxes in this country. Australia was on point to test the implementation of carbon taxes, but you know, we're now coming online. So it's not over, they're just taking it a little bit more slowly. So, you know, time is not on our side. I think we've got, at best, the remainder of this year to try to get this into the mass consciousness and get it like poll tax so that the politicians realise and the corporations realise that this is not going to wash with the population of this country. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing that with me tonight.